Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we grab the source material, you send our way articles, research, you name it, and we really dig in to pull out the most important bits, the key insights. Think of it as, well, your shortcut to getting genuinely up to speed, maybe with some surprising facts along the way. So today we are diving deep into the economic effects, the ripple effects of the Trump administration's tariffs. Our main source here is a recent OECD report, and specifically how it's analyzed in an article by Chris Lehnes. Our mission, then, is to unpack what this source material actually found. How did these trade policies really hit the global economy, and why look at this report, this article? Well, because it seems to give a pretty detailed assessment, looking across different economic areas, growth, inflation, jobs. It goes beyond the headlines.
Exactly. And what's interesting is how the analysis really connects those specific policy actions, like putting on a tariff, to these much broader economic outcomes. It really shows you how complex these global systems are, how interconnected everything is. You push here, something happens way over there.
Okay, let's get into it. The source material, it says there was a clear shift, a real departure from how the U.S. usually handled trade policy. What was that core shift?
Well, the article frames the administration's strategy as a very deliberate use of tariffs. The idea, according to the source, was to protect American manufacturing, try to reduce trade deficits, and also confront what they saw as, let's say, unfair trade practices from other countries.
Right. And it wasn't just one or two things. It spanned quite a bit.
Oh, definitely. It started, maybe with steel and aluminum, but the article says it broadened out electronics, textiles, cars, and it hit major trading partners. Think China, the EU, Canada, Mexico. It became a much wider confrontation, especially with China. And the source points out this forced companies to start rethinking their supply chains, their investments.
Which costs money.
Which absolutely came at a cost, yeah. That's a key finding noted here.
So what was the first big noticeable consequence then, according to this analysis? The immediate fallout.
Well, probably the most visible thing the article highlights is a pretty sharp slowdown in global economic growth. The report apparently details how global GDP, it was doing pretty well before the tariffs hit. Good momentum, but that momentum just sort of faltered afterwards.
And they specifically mentioned the OECD itself lowering forecasts. That's in the article.
Yes, that's right. The article notes the OECD revised its growth forecasts downwards pretty much across the board. Advanced economies were projected to grow slower than usual, and emerging markets really felt it too. The report apparently notes they're quite sensitive to global demand, commodity prices, things like that.
And how much did plain old uncertainty factor into that slowdown?
That's a really important point the source makes. The uncertainty itself was a major drag. When trade rules feel unpredictable, businesses tend to pause, they delay investments, maybe hold off on hiring, cut back production. It makes sense, right? Hard to plan long term.
Okay, here's where the source says things get, well, kind of ironic. It suggests the U.S., the country that started these policies, was actually among the hardest hit. How does the analysis explain that?
Yeah, the report calls it ironic. It says the immediate hit was felt by both consumers and businesses inside the U.S. Import duties just made foreign goods more expensive. And for businesses, especially ones with complicated supply chains, that meant higher costs for their inputs.
Manufacturers specifically.
Absolutely. The article cites sectors like automotive, electronics, machinery. They either had to, eat those costs.
Or pass them on.
Or pass them on to consumers. And that, the source says, started pushing up inflation. Not necessarily because everyone was buying tons more stuff, but because the cost of making things went up. And then the report noted consumer spending, which is, a huge driver of the U.S. economy, started showing signs of, fatigue. Plus, investment slowed down, too.
So this inflation wasn't like a sign of a booming economy, according to the analysis. It was a different kind.
Exactly. The report makes that distinction. It calls it cost-push inflation. Prices going up because the costs baked into the supply chain rose. It's different from demand pull, where prices rise because demand is just super high. Think of it like the price of bread goes up because wheat costs more, not because everyone suddenly wants 10 loaves.
Okay. And who did the report say felt this the most? Who bore the brunt?
The analysis highlights it fell disproportionately on consumers, especially lower-income households, who spend more of their budget on goods that might face tariffs. And also smaller businesses, SMEs, They often don't have the same wiggle room as big corporations to absorb costs or quickly find new suppliers, so they felt the financial strain.
Did this make life harder for, say, the Federal Reserve, central banks trying to manage things?
Oh, yeah. The report points out it created a real dilemma for central banks. Do you tighten policy to fight this cost-driven inflation? But that could choke off growth that's already slowing. Or do you keep policy loose to support growth, but then risk inflation expectations getting kind of stuck? It's a tough balancing act.
That word uncertainty just keeps coming up. It sounds like the report sees it as a major cost in itself. How badly did it hit business investment?
The report is pretty blunt about it, actually. It says uncertainty is basically poison for investment. And it describes the trade policy environment back then as a, quote, textbook example of unpredictability. You know, the sort of back and forth, the abrupt announcements. It just made businesses really hesitant about big, long-term spending plans.
And this wasn't just U.S. companies feeling hesitant. Did it affect investment coming into the U.S.?
Yes, the article mentions a slowdown in foreign direct investment, FDI, coming into the U.S. And there are also findings suggesting American firms were, well, looking more seriously at offshoring some operations, basically seeking out places that seemed more stable, more predictable. The report apparently saw this reflected in things like capital spending data and business sentiment surveys, which both dipped.
Were certain industries mentioned as being particularly affected by this investment chill?
The source points to industries that rely heavily on those complex global value chains. So think high-tech manufacturing, aerospace, consumer electronics. The report suggests they were hitting pause, deferring, or even canceling expansion plans because the environment was just too uncertain.
What about the jobs picture? A big part of the argument was bringing jobs back, right?
Yeah.
Especially manufacturing. What did the report find there?
Well, the analysis suggests the labor market actually showed some signs of stress. Job growth overall seemed to moderate. And critically, sectors really exposed to trade manufacturing, but also agriculture, saw layoffs, reduced hours, that kind of thing.
Agriculture, you mentioned. Farmers were singled out.
Yes, the article highlights farmers being quite vocal critics. The report details how the retaliatory tariffs from other countries often hit U.S. farm exports hard. Soybeans, pork, dairy, it led to surpluses here, falling prices for those goods, and real financial distress in many rural areas.
And the manufacturing jobs. Did that big comeback happen, according to the report?
The report suggests, well, not really, not in a big way. There might have been some small gains, but the analysis describes them as modest, and apparently not enough to offset losses in other areas. Plus, the report touches on how modern manufacturing often needs, advanced skills, lots of capital investment. It's not always easy to just add tons of jobs quickly.
Okay, stepping back a bit. How did all this tariff activity mess with the way things are actually made and shipped around the world, those global supply chains?
Right. The report explains that modern manufacturing, it's built on these incredibly intricate networks. Parts and materials cross borders multiple times. Tariffs just throw a wrench in that. They add costs, create delays, snarl up logistics. It disrupts the whole flow.
So companies had to scramble and change things.
Exactly. The report found companies were actively trying to reconfigure where they got their stuff from, looking for suppliers in countries not hit by tariffs, maybe investing in factories closer to where they sell their products. But the analysis is clear. Making those changes is really expensive, it takes time, and often you lose efficiency. And guess who usually ends up paying those higher costs?
The consumer, eventually.
Right.
Passed along down the line.
Did the report give any specific industry examples of this supply chain disruption?
The article mentions automakers. They're a classic example, right? They rely on components from all over the place. The report notes that tariffs on just one small part can mess up their whole system, especially since many operate on that just-in-time delivery model.
And this wasn't just a U.S. story, was it? What did the report say about the spillover onto other countries, the trading partners?
Definitely not just the U.S. The analysis really emphasizes the fallout was global. Countries really tightly linked to the U.S. economy like Canada and Mexico obviously felt it significantly. They faced direct tariffs, plus all that general uncertainty we talked about. And what about big economies further away? Europe, Asia.
Yes, export-focused economies there felt it too. The report suggests lower demand from the U.S., plus their own input costs potentially rising because of tariffs, slowed down their production and exports. And then, of course, when they retaliated with their own tariffs, that hurt their producers' access to the U.S. market. So it cut both ways.
How about emerging markets in all this? How did they fare?
The report points to kind of a double whammy for them. On one side, fewer export opportunities because global demand was slowing and markets were getting restricted. On the other side, they saw capital flowing out as investors got nervous and moved money to perceived safer places, like advanced economies. The analysis shows this led to things like their currencies weakening, inflation picking up, and tighter money conditions in many developing nations.
Let's bring it back to people. How did all this uncertainty, the rising costs, how did it affect everyday consumers according to the report? Did it hit confidence?
The report really emphasizes that. Tariffs might sound like abstract policy, but they had real effects on people's wallets and their outlook. As prices went up a bit and you constantly heard about trade disputes in the news, consumer sentiment started to dip. The analysis looked at surveys showing people were becoming more pessimistic about the future, about jobs, about whether things would be affordable.
And that kind of feeling can feed on itself, right? Create a negative cycle.
Exactly. The report suggests that's a real worry. If consumers get nervous, they might cut back on spending. That means less demand in the economy, which leads to slower growth, and could even affect jobs down the road. It can become self-reinforcing.
Did the report mention if retailers were actually seeing this change in shopper behavior?
Yeah, the article mentions reports from retailers who noticed things like slower foot traffic, maybe weaker sales, particularly for stuff that's heavily imported. Maybe discount stores or online retailers did a bit better. But the source suggests the overall retail climate definitely got tougher.
So beyond just the price tag of the tariffs, the report really hammers home that the uncertainty itself was a major economic problem.
That's absolutely a core point in the analysis. Businesses, they need stability. They need clear rules of the road to plan, to invest. And the analysis describes the policy environment then as, well, quite volatile. Abrupt shifts, sudden announcements. It just creates a really difficult environment to operate in.
And the report suggests this had broader implications for how the U.S. was viewed globally.
The analysis argues that this volatility kind of chipped away at global confidence in the U.S. as, a reliable, predictable partner in trade. The report even points to some countries actively working on trade deals that didn't include the U.S. during that period, which could potentially reduce U.S. influence on shaping global trade rules over time.
What about domestically? Did that uncertainty leave a mark on the policy debate itself?
The article notes that trade policy became very politicized, very contentious, and the report suggests this makes it harder to find common ground, bipartisan agreement on the best path forward, which raises the risk, according to the source, that these kinds of trade tensions and the associated uncertainty could actually stick around no matter who's in charge.
So looking forward, does the report suggest some of these impacts are maybe not just temporary blips? Could there be longer-term structural changes happening?
Yes, the analysis does draw that distinction. Some effects might fade, but others could have more lasting consequences. It specifically mentions things like the potential weakening of multilateral institutions like the WTO, the bodies that set global trade rules, also the big shifts in supply chains we discussed, and changes in where global investment flows. These could be more structural, longer-lasting changes.
And what could that mean down the road for the global economy, for the U.S.?
Well, the report suggests these trends could point towards a more fragmented global economy, maybe more regional trading blocks, less overall integration, potentially less efficiency than we've seen. For the U.S., the potential risks highlighted include maybe diminished leadership in setting global economic rules, and possibly reduced access to some important emerging markets if the world becomes more fragmented.
And inside the U.S., any long-term concerns raised in the report?
There is a warning in the analysis, that if you move too far away from open markets, you risk entrenching inefficiencies at home. Companies might feel less pressure to innovate if they're protected. So even if some industries get a temporary shield, the report suggests the lack of competitive pressure could lead to, well, maybe complacency, slower growth in the long run. Especially since, as we discussed, the big job gains didn't really seem to materialize according to the data presented.
Wow. Okay. So bringing this all together, this deep dive into the OECD report via Chris Lehnes article, what's the main takeaway according to the source?
The conclusion the source material draws is pretty stark, actually. It suggests the economic costs of the protectionist policies were significant and growing. The analysis basically says the promised benefits, like a big manufacturing revival or slashing the trade deficit, didn't really show up in the data in a major way. Instead, the evidence presented points towards slower growth globally and domestically, higher inflation than otherwise, weaker investment, and declining confidence from both businesses and consumers.
So the report implies policymakers should maybe rethink that approach based on these findings.
Yes, that's a strong implication. A key recommendation seems to be the need to re-engage with international partners, try to rebuild trust in those multilateral systems like the WTO, and really base trade policy on solid data, long-term thinking, and transparency, rather than, sudden, unpredictable moves.
And for businesses trying to operate in this kind of world, what's the lesson?
The takeaway highlighted for companies is really about agility. Being adaptable. Success means being able to navigate complexity and maybe diversifying markets so you're not too reliant on one place, and just constantly investing in innovation to stay ahead.
And the source material wraps up with a pretty powerful concluding thought.
It does. It basically concludes that in our world today, which is so interconnected, real lasting prosperity doesn't come from building walls. It comes from building bridges. It emphasizes cooperation, finding mutual benefits rather than constant confrontation.
That definitely gives us a lot to chew on from this deep dive into the report's assessment. What strikes you most from this analysis we've walked through? Where do you see that tension playing out? The desire to protect domestic industries versus the complex realities of a globalized economy.